December 8, 1941. Dawn breaks pale and brittle over the frost-bitten plains of Iowa. A thin film of ice glitters on the stubble of a harvested cornfield, and in the distance, a lone figure moves slowly through the mist, his breath visible, his steps measured. The sound of a tractor engine sputters and hums, steady and loyal, as if unaware that the world beyond the horizon has just been set on fire. The man at the wheel, Harold Whitaker, wipes his brow with a gloved hand, though the air is sharp enough to bite. He's a farmer by trade, 38 years old, the kind of man who speaks more through effort than words. But this morning, even he has fallen silent. The radio, perched on the fender beside him, crackles with a voice that carries more weight than the winter air. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The words drift across the open field and seem to freeze there. Harold shuts off the tractor, and the sudden silence feels like a held breath. He stands for a long time, staring out across the land that has always given him purpose. Rows of dark soil stretch to the edge of his sight, a pattern of order in a world that suddenly feels chaotic. His son, Raymond, is only 12, still asleep inside the farmhouse. His wife, Anna, will be making breakfast soon, pretending not to worry, though her hands will tremble as she pours the coffee. The Whitakers, like millions of American families, are about to discover that the war they'd followed from newspaper clippings and crackling broadcasts is no longer someone else's story. Before the year is out, it will reach into their barns, their fields, even their engines. For now, though, Harold's world is simple. He has seed to sort, soil to turn, and a machine that never fails him, a John Deere Model A, its green paint faded, its engine tough as the men who built it. He doesn't know it yet, but the heart of that tractor will soon find its way to battlefields halfway across the world. What begins as the daily rhythm of rural America is about to become part of a machinery far larger than any one man can imagine. Across the country, that same morning in Chicago's industrial district, another man listens to the same broadcast. Charlie Dyer, 33, is an engineer at Alice Chalmers. His workspace smells of oil, iron, and ambition. The attack on Pearl Harbor has thrown the nation into panic, but for men like Charlie, it sparks something different, a grim determination. He spent years perfecting diesel tractor engines meant to outlast droughts and floods, engines built for endurance rather than speed. Now, he's thinking of them differently. The Army has been talking about converting civilian machines for war use, but few believed it would come to this. Charlie leans over his drafting table and studies the blueprints. He runs his finger along a line that represents the cylinder head. If it can survive the Dust Bowl, he mutters, it can survive the desert. The contrast is striking. Harold, the farmer who depends on the engine to live, and Charlie, the engineer who gave that engine its heartbeat. They've never met, and likely never will, yet their lives are bound by the same hum of pistons and promise. Both are part of an America that still believes its strength lies in work, in problem-solving, in the quiet conviction that anything can be fixed if you take it apart and build it better. As the war machine begins to awaken, factories that once produced tractors and plows receive new orders: bulldozers for the Army Corps of Engineers, trucks for the infantry, tanks for the front. The government calls it total mobilization. By January 1942, more than 200 companies have been contacted by the War Production Board. The lines between farm and factory blur. Diesel engines once destined for wheat fields are now being fitted into armored vehicles. The same mechanics who tuned them for harvest are enlisted to keep them running in deserts and jungles. America is learning to fight not just with rifles and bombs, but with torque, traction, and timing. The newspapers fill with photographs of tanks rolling off assembly lines where tractors once stood. The captions read, "From plowshares to power." But behind the patriotic slogans, there's uncertainty. Engineers like Charlie know the challenge ahead isn't just building machines, it's building ones that can survive. The European mud is thicker than Iowa clay. The Pacific salt air eats metal like acid. Gasoline engines stall, freeze, and overheat. Diesel, however, is stubborn, it endures. That's when Charlie begins to understand. The solution to modern mechanized warfare might lie in America's barns, not its armories. Meanwhile, Harold watches his neighbor's sons leave for training. The postman delivers letters edged in blue and red, the kind that carry goodbyes. The war feels distant, yet its shadow grows long. Gasoline rationing begins. Tractor fuel becomes precious, and Harold learns to stretch every drop. "We're feeding an army now," he tells Raymond, who helps him grease the gears. The boy doesn't understand the weight behind the words. To him, it's still just a tractor, a noisy, stubborn machine that smells like earth and smoke. But to Harold, it's the only thing standing between survival and ruin. What he doesn't realize is that this same model of tractor, and thousands like it, are being studied in secret workshops across the nation. The U.S. Army is quietly testing their engines for something far greater. By spring, the first prototypes appear, modified bulldozers with reinforced armor, engines built to drag the impossible. These machines, born from farm technology, are capable of clearing forests, building runways, and pulling tanks out of mud. The press won't hear about it for years, but the military gives the project a code name, Project Mule. The idea is simple: use the strength of American agriculture to move mountains. Charlie is one of the engineers assigned to the design team. He writes to his wife, "We're building the kind of machines that don't quit, no matter the weather." Sound familiar? The story of the tractor's transformation begins quietly, almost invisibly, under the rhythmic clatter of factory belts and the distant thunder of war reports. It is not glamorous, but it is relentless. America's strength has always come from what happens behind the scenes, from the grease-stained hands, the late nights under a flickering bulb, the men who fix instead of boast. As one war correspondent would later write, while the world praised the generals, it was the farmers who built the engines that made their victories possible. By the end of 1942, Harold's fields lie dormant under snow, but his tractor is gone. He sold it to the Army after receiving a notice that his model's engine was valuable for national defense. The barn feels empty without it. Some nights he wonders where it went. Maybe it's still in a factory yard, maybe it's already overseas. He can't know that in a few months, a machine built on the same design will be crawling across the deserts of North Africa, clearing paths for American tanks. The world has changed faster than anyone expected. Harold still works the land with borrowed tools, his hands cracked, his back bent, but when he listens to the radio at night, he feels a strange pride. The same hum that once plowed his soil now rumbles across continents. The same sound that woke his son every morning now wakes soldiers in the field. The farmer and the engineer, the plow and the tank, different parts of the same heartbeat. The war has only begun, but already the lines are drawn, between the old world and the new, between the engines that fed men and the engines that will save them. Somewhere out there, in the rumble of machines being tested and the voices of men who refuse to stop working, a quiet revolution is underway. The fields of America are going to war, and the tractor that once turned the soil will soon turn the tide. The warehouse on Chicago's west side smelled of steel dust, sweat, and hope disguised as hard work. Beneath the buzzing fluorescence, rows of dismantled tractors sat in various stages of disassembly, some stripped bare, others reborn into something unrecognizable. Charlie Dyer wiped his hands on a rag blackened from oil. He'd been at it since before dawn, coaxing new life out of the familiar green machines that once roamed the farmlands. The Army had sent new specifications last week, a stack of papers stamped confidential. They wanted the same reliable diesel heart that powered the Alice Chalmers Model B tractor, only this time it needed to survive gunfire, sandstorms, and the crushing weight of war. The engineers called it an adaptation. Charlie called it a gamble. He knew what these engines could do in a drought or a flood, but war was a different kind of storm. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall, quieting the city's usual roar. Inside, the clang of wrenches and the hiss of acetylene torches filled the air like music. Every sound meant progress. Every spark was a promise that the work mattered. Charlie's assistant, a wiry 20-year-old named Ben Harper, leaned over a workbench, measuring piston heads with the kind of focus only youth could bring. "You really think these things you'll make a difference?" he asked. Charlie didn't look up. "I don't think. I know." He said it calmly, but even he could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing at the edges of his confidence. The conflict that consumed his thoughts wasn't against an enemy overseas, but against time itself. America was still catching up, its factories shifting from tractors to tanks, from harvesters to haulers. The War Production Board demanded speed. There were deadlines, quotas, and no room for mistakes. Yet beneath that pressure, something remarkable was happening. Men like Charlie, who had once built machines for peace, were discovering that their craftsmanship, the patience of farmers, the precision of mechanics, was now a weapon. In another part of the plant, engineers tested the new prototype, a diesel bulldozer modified for the Army Corps of Engineers. Its engine roared, echoing off the concrete walls like thunder trapped in a bottle. The test supervisor shouted over the noise, "She runs clean, but can she climb?" They would find out soon enough. The Army wanted these machines shipped to the Pacific, where mud and coral had swallowed trucks whole. A regular gasoline engine would choke in hours. Diesel, thick and stubborn, promised endurance. Charlie had designed a new filtration system to keep the engine breathing even in sandstorms. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Each success carried the ghosts of failure. In January 1943, a shipment of untested engines had broken down en route to Tunisia. Fuel lines froze. Bearings cracked. The soldiers who relied on them had been forced to dig by hand under enemy fire. Charlie had read the after-action report 3 times. He could still hear the line that haunted him, "They weren't built for war, they were built for work." That sentence became his mantra. From then on, he built every engine as if it were the difference between survival and death. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Harold Whitaker's farm stood half empty. His tractor had been sold to the Army months ago, and the replacement never came. He made do with borrowed equipment from neighbors, but it wasn't the same. The land felt different, lonelier, somehow. Letters from Raymond, now 16 and working at a local machine depot, spoke of rumors that the old John Deere engines were being used in the South Pacific. "They say those tractors can climb cliffs," the boy wrote. Harold smiled when he read it. The notion was absurd, but comforting. He imagined his tractor out there somewhere, its steel bones doing something noble. Maybe it was clearing airstrips, maybe hauling supplies. Maybe it was fighting in its own way. The truth was stranger than he could guess. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army's Seabees were using diesel-powered bulldozers, many built from the same blueprints as Harold's old Model A, to carve runways into Pacific islands. Soldiers swore by them. They could push through mud, sand, even jungle. One Marine reportedly joked, "When the Lord said move the mountains, he must have been talking about a caterpillar." The machines became legends in the field. They built bases, cleared roads, and pulled wrecked tanks from swamps. Without them, many operations would have stalled. Back in Chicago, Charlie read the field reports with a quiet pride that bordered on disbelief. He'd never seen combat, but through his engines, he was part of it. Each machine that made it through another mission felt like a personal victory. Yet there were darker notes between the lines. Diesel fuel was harder to supply, and the weight of the engines made transport slower. For every success story, there was another about breakdowns, shortages, or men stranded waiting for parts. Charlie and his team worked 14-hour shifts trying to refine designs, cutting weight without cutting strength. Sleep became a luxury, food an afterthought. "We're not building tractors anymore," he told Ben one night, "we're building lifelines." The Army began sending liaisons to the factories. Stern men in uniforms who knew little about engineering but plenty about deadlines. They carried stopwatches and clipboards, counting output like ammunition. The partnership between farmer ingenuity and military necessity was uneasy, but effective. In less than 2 years, production of diesel-powered vehicles had tripled. The War Department even issued a statement crediting civilian adaptation as a decisive advantage in logistics. Most Americans never read it, but Charlie kept a copy pinned above his desk. Still, the moral cost gnawed at him. Each time he saw a completed machine roll out the factory doors, he felt pride mixed with a quiet unease. These engines were born to feed, not to fight. Their sound, the rhythmic chug of power and persistence, had once meant peace. Now it meant something entirely different. One afternoon, during a rare break, he confessed his thoughts to Ben. You ever think about what these'll be used for? He asked. Ben shrugged. To win, he said simply. Charlie nodded, but the answer didn't comfort him. By late 1943, the factory's success became its curse. Demand grew faster than capacity. Parts shortages plagued production. Rubber, steel, even bolts were rationed. Tempers flared. Mistakes crept in. Charlie found himself mediating arguments between engineers and military officers. We can't make miracles, one foreman shouted. No, Charlie replied quietly, but we can make machines that survive them. His calm authority earned respect. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was the quiet leader of men driven by a shared purpose none of them had foreseen. The first shipment of the upgraded diesel engines reached the Pacific that December. Reports came back weeks later. They performed flawlessly under conditions that would have crippled any gasoline motor. The Navy sent a brief commendation. Charlie didn't smile often, but that night he allowed himself one. He thought of Harold, though he didn't know his name, of all the farmers who'd once trusted these engines with their harvests. Now they were harvesting something else. Victory, built one machine at a time. Yet as winter deepened, Charlie couldn't shake a question that lingered in the back of his mind. If a farm engine could win battles, what else could it change? Could the same principles, the same simplicity and resilience, build a better world after the war? He didn't have the answer. Not yet. But he knew this much: the machines they built weren't just tools anymore. They were symbols of something larger, a belief that even in war, creation could still triumph over destruction. And though none of them knew it then, the greatest test of their engines, and their own endurance, was still to come. The battlefield would move from factories and test tracks to places no tractor was ever meant to go. The machines were ready. The men, perhaps less so. But they would learn, as all builders do, that strength is not in what you make, but in what survives. The beaches of Normandy did not welcome men, they devoured them. Dawn on June 6, 1944, was a blur of fog, fire, and disbelief. Among the chaos, a low, steady rumble cut through the screams and surf, a sound so out of place it seemed almost absurd. It was the growl of a diesel bulldozer, crawling across the sand as bullets struck the steel around it. Private Earl Thompson, a Kansas farm boy turned CB engineer, gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. He had driven tractors all his life, plowing wheat fields that stretched past the horizon. Now, the field before him was littered with craters, bodies, and twisted metal. The same engine that once tilled soil back home was clearing wreckage on the bloodiest beach in the world. It wasn't supposed to make it this far ashore, but neither was he. When Earl volunteered for the Navy's construction battalions, he thought he'd be building runways, not dodging mortar fire. But he understood engines like other men understood prayer. The diesel beneath him was a Caterpillar D7. Its heart descended from the same tractors he'd grown up repairing. Its thick steel body and low center of gravity made it nearly impossible to stop. Shell fragments pinged off its armor as it pushed debris aside, carving a path for the tanks struggling to land behind it. "Come on, old girl," he muttered through gritted teeth. "We've plowed worse." The irony was bitter and beautiful, machines born for peace now clearing a way through hell. On a hill overlooking the beach, a war correspondent scribbled notes between explosions. He would later write, "The bulldozers moved like blind giants, unafraid of death, driven by farmers who had traded wheat for war." It was true. Many of the men operating those machines came from the American Midwest. They didn't see themselves as soldiers. They were builders, men of earth and grease and grit. And yet, on that morning, their machines saved more lives than anyone would ever count. In the months that followed, those same engines became the unsung heroes of every front. In Italy, they cleared mountain roads under sniper fire. In the Pacific, they carved runways out of jungles so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. And in France, they transformed muddy fields into highways of liberation. The war, by now, was as much a battle of endurance as firepower, and endurance was what these engines knew best. Back in Chicago, Charles Dyer received the first photographs from the European front. They showed his designs in motion, diesel bulldozers marked with white stars pushing through the ruins of French villages. Men stood beside them, grinning in the mud. He studied the photos in silence, his hand trembling slightly as he traced the outline of a machine he knew by heart. "She's holding up," he whispered. Ben, standing behind him, said nothing. They both knew what those engines were enduring: sand, rain, gunfire, and grief. Charlie had built them to last, but he hadn't imagined they'd carry the weight of war's heaviest burdens. Letters from the field told stories that official reports never did. Earl wrote one to his sister back home. "You wouldn't believe what these engines can do. We built an airstrip in 3 days using machines Dad used to call field crawlers. They don't quit, not even when we want to." He didn't mention the men who didn't make it, the ones buried beside their machines in hastily dug graves. The war had turned the landscape into something monstrous, but the engines kept going, unflinching, as if refusing to let human fragility slow them down. The central conflict was no longer just between nations. It was between creation and destruction. Every bomb that fell undid the work of a dozen builders, but they built again, faster, stronger, more determined. Charlie felt that same struggle within himself. Pride warred with guilt. He knew his engines were saving lives, yet they were also tools of a war that consumed everything in its path. When he spoke to a group of new engineers one evening, he said quietly, "Don't think of these machines as weapons. Think of them as shields. They move so others can move forward." It became the unspoken creed of his team. In the Pacific, that philosophy found its truest test. The island of Peleliu was a furnace of coral and death, where temperatures soared past 100 degrees and the soil tore at steel like teeth. When the Marines landed, the bulldozers followed close behind. Their treads ground over sand slick with salt and blood, pushing aside wreckage, building cover. Earl was there again, his uniform soaked with sweat, his face hidden behind goggles caked with dust. "You learn to trust the sound," he later told a reporter. "If the engine's running, you're alive. When it stops, you pray." The D7 he drove outlasted the battle. So did he. Charlie received a commendation from the War Department that winter. It praised his innovation in diesel adaptation for hostile environments. He placed it in a drawer and never mentioned it again. The real reward came in the form of a letter forwarded through military channels. It was from a Marine engineer who had used one of his bulldozers in the field. The final line read, "Tell whoever built these that their machine saved 100 men, maybe more." Charlie read it once, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something close to peace. But even victories carried shadows. The engines were pushed beyond their limits. Parts broke, supplies ran thin, and repair crews scavenged from wrecks. Some machines were left behind, buried where they fell, half swallowed by mud or coral. To the soldiers who had relied on them, those engines became silent monuments, reminders that even machines could give everything they had. Earl once returned to a site where one had sunk halfway into the ground. He stood there for a long time, hand resting on the rusted hood. "She did her job," he said softly, as if speaking to an old friend. Then he turned and walked away. By 1944's end, the tide of war was turning. The Allied advance had become unstoppable, powered by an army of machines that owed their lineage to the American heartland. Charlie's designs now rolled through Europe by the thousands, diesel engines hauling supplies, pulling artillery, rebuilding bridges almost as fast as they were destroyed. Yet the war had changed him. The once idealistic engineer now carried a quiet gravity. He understood that progress came with a cost. "You can't build without breaking something first," he told Ben one night, "but it's what you build afterward that matters." For men like Earl, that truth was carved into every scar on their hands. When the guns went silent in France, he walked beside the same bulldozer that had carried him through the storm at Normandy. The engine sputtered, then died. He stood there listening to the stillness that followed. It was the first time in years he'd heard silence without fear. For a long moment, he didn't know what to do with it. Then he smiled faintly and patted the steel. "Rest easy, old girl," he whispered. "You've earned it." Across the ocean, in a Chicago warehouse now nearly empty, Charlie closed the last production ledger. The factory floor was quiet again, as if the war had never happened. But he knew better. The machines they built had become something immortal, not in glory, but in purpose. They had turned the soil of war and planted the seeds of peace. Still, one question haunted him as he locked the door behind him. Now that the machines had survived the war, what would men do with the peace they'd won? August 15, 1945. The war was over. Church bells rang through small towns and city streets alike, and for the first time in years, factory whistles blew not in urgency, but celebration. In Chicago, Charlie Dyer stood alone in the empty assembly hall that had once roared with the clatter of hammers and steel. The air was still thick with the scent of oil and sweat, ghosts of labor that refused to leave. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, touching the dust in golden rays, and for a moment he imagined he could still hear the engines, steady, defiant, alive. He set down his clipboard and exhaled, realizing how quiet victory could sound. He was not the same man who had walked into this place 4 years earlier. His hair had thinned, his hands were scarred, and behind his calm eyes lived something that looked like wisdom but felt more like exhaustion. The Army's final contract sat unsigned on his desk, authorizing one last shipment of spare parts to Europe. There would be no more blueprints, no more late-night tests, no more deadlines enforced by men with clipboards and guns. The war had taken everything it could from him. His youth, his certainty, even his sleep, but it had given him something, too. He just didn't know what yet. Outside, the streets erupted with cheers. People hugged strangers. Factory girls danced on car roofs. Ben Harper burst through the door, his grin wide enough to light the room. "It's done," he shouted. "They've surrendered." Charlie smiled faintly. "I heard," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben looked at the empty machines around them and frowned. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Charlie nodded. "Stranger than I expected." For a long time they said nothing. The silence felt heavier than the war ever had. Across the ocean, on an airstrip carved from volcanic rock, Earl Thompson climbed down from a bulldozer for what he knew would be the last time. The sun was setting over Okinawa, turning the sky the color of burnt copper. He ran his hand over the hood of the machine, tracing the dents and bullet scars like old memories. It had survived everything: shellfire, storms, and sabotage. So had he. "You made it, girl," he murmured, his voice soft with gratitude. Around him, men were laughing, lighting cigarettes, daring to dream again. But Earl just stood there, staring at the horizon. The machine had given him purpose when fear had nearly broken him. Now peace had returned, and he wasn't sure where he fit anymore. In the months that followed, ships began hauling the machines home, or scrapping them where they stood. The bulldozers that had cleared battlefields were loaded onto cargo decks beside tanks and jeeps, silent witnesses to history being packed away. Some were melted down for new steel, others sold to contractors rebuilding Europe's shattered cities. And so the engines that had torn through war began laying the foundations of peace. In France, a machine with a cracked serial plate, one of Charlie's, was used to rebuild a bridge over the Seine. In the Philippines, another cleared debris from a destroyed village, its operator an American volunteer who'd stayed behind to help. Everywhere they went, these machines carried echoes of their origins: the hum of the Midwest, the rhythm of farms, the patience of builders. Charlie was called to Washington that winter to receive a citation from the War Department. He stood in a polished office where the walls were lined with photographs of generals and medals. A colonel read the citation aloud, commending his contributions to the mechanical success of Allied operations. When he finished, Charlie thanked him politely but refused to give a speech. On his way out, he stopped by a window overlooking the Potomac. The river shimmered in the pale light, endless and quiet. He thought of Harold Whitaker, though he still didn't know his name, the farmers who had given their engines, their hands, their hearts to a war they never wanted. "It wasn't us," he said softly to his reflection. "It was them." Back home in Iowa, Harold was one of the few who still worked the land the old way. His fields were smaller now, his hair grayer, but when the first shipment of surplus tractors arrived from the War Department in 1946, he bought one immediately. It came in a crate marked U.S. Army property and smelled faintly of salt and fuel. When he lifted the hood, he froze. The engine inside was identical to the one he'd sold years ago. He couldn't prove it was his, but when he turned the key and heard the deep, familiar chug of diesel, he felt something in his chest loosen. "Welcome home," he said under his breath. That machine worked his fields for 20 more years. Raymond grew up, took over the farm, and told his children the story of how their tractor had once fought in a war. "Grandpa says it pushed tanks," the youngest would say, eyes wide with disbelief. Harold never corrected them. Let them believe it, he thought. Maybe it had. By the time Charlie retired, the war was history taught in classrooms, its machinery displayed in museums or rusting in forgotten lots. He visited one such museum once, a converted hangar outside Kansas City. There, among the gleaming planes and tanks, stood a single diesel bulldozer with a plaque that read, "Used in Normandy, 1944. Engine type, Alice Chalmers diesel conversion." He ran his hand along its side, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingertips. It was his design, one of the first. He imagined Earl driving it, the roar of the surf, the chaos of the beach. For a moment he could almost smell the salt and smoke. An elderly veteran stood beside him, leaning on a cane. "She was a beauty, wasn't she?" the man said. Charlie turned. It took him a second to realize who he was looking at. The face was older, worn, but unmistakable. Earl Thompson smiled faintly. "I drove one just like her in France," he said. "Never thought I'd see her again." Charlie hesitated, then extended his hand. "I built her," he said quietly. Earl blinked, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding. "Then I guess we both owe her our lives," he replied. They stood there for a long time, two men bound by a machine that had outlasted them both. Before leaving, Charlie looked back once more. "Funny," he said softly, "how something made for dirt could survive a war." Earl chuckled. "Maybe that's why it did. Dirt's honest. War isn't." Outside, the air smelled of rain. Charlie tilted his face toward the clouds. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of everything he'd built, and everything he hadn't, lift just enough for him to breathe freely. The world had been rebuilt with the same engines that once tore it apart, and in that paradox lay a kind of grace. That night, as thunder rolled across the plains, Harold sat on his porch watching his tractor idle in the barn. The steady hum drifted through the night air, deep and familiar. It sounded like peace. He closed his eyes and listened, unaware that hundreds of miles away, another man, the engineer who had built its heart, was hearing the same sound in his memory. Across distance and time, the rhythm was the same. A pulse of endurance, a hymn of labor, a quiet promise that what is built with purpose never truly dies. History would forget their names, but not their work. Long after metals tarnished and monuments crumbled, the legacy of their machines remained. In the bridges that held, the roads that stretched, the soil that healed. The war had forged a strange kinship between farmer, engineer, and soldier, a trinity of endurance that built not just victory, but recovery. And so, as dawn broke over the quiet heartland once more, the hum of a tractor echoed across the fields. It was the same sound that had carried men through battle, rebuilt cities, and fed nations. The same heartbeat of iron and oil. The same reminder that even in the darkest hours, the engines of creation will always outlast the engines of destruction. Please subscribe our channel and like the video if you like our content and comment what we have to upload next. Live long, stay blessed.